Hi everybody. I'm really happy to be here. This is a great event, and I'm here to share my experience about going back to Redux and reappreciating Redux. A quick note before this talk started, I wrote this talk before hooks were announced. So in case you're wondering, I am going to address hooks towards the end of my talk, and I think it'll fit nicely actually with what I'm saying. So before we get into it, let's just a bit of an introduction. Again, my name is Max. I'm a software engineer at PayPal. I work primarily in JavaScript, and I specialize in React and building new products. I wanted to mention that I build new products because, in my experience, engineers who work on open source and engineers who build products often have different priorities. And I'm sure there's many of you in the audience now who are working on products and will read tutorials or read what open source developers have to say and think like, OK, it's harder to adapt or to understand how it fits into what I'm doing. Our code is grittier, and we have a greater emphasis on simplicity and durability. Accordingly, the tools we use become less desirable the more clever they are. Something that might save me time and lines of code up front might be good for the first few weeks of a project, but if I ultimately don't understand what's going on, the tool could become unsustainable as soon as the first unforeseen problem arises. Furthermore, in my experience, new tools that emphasize cleverness or handle too much for me often do not take into consideration every edge case. And it can also be hard to refactor the tool properly and update it for edge cases. And since I work at PayPal, I write products that deal with millions of merchants and hundreds of millions of consumers. So I could tell you we have a lot of edge cases, which is why so many PayPal tools are actually built internally. Not because we think we're better, but because we've tried a lot of the alternatives, and they often just won't work for our use cases. So let's talk briefly about the front-end landscape today. So JavaScript developers, especially front-end developers, we constantly have to re-examine the technological tooling landscape. This is both a benefit and a potential pitfall of our profession. On the one hand, I've never met an engineer that's not interested in learning new things, making applications more efficient, and expanding their knowledge. But on the other hand, I think we've all experienced a time where we've been burned by some technology. We used it because it was the cool, hot new thing, and that only turned out to be a tech debt-generating nightmare later on. So I'm here to talk a little bit about my experience with this on a recent project at PayPal. We had a brand new project, and we eagerly jumped at the chance to use whatever contemporary technology we wanted. And we spent some time researching the shape that our repository would look like. So this talk is as much about reappreciating Redux as it is kind of what I learned finding a way, what I learned as a way to appreciate and adequately identify the benefits of a new technology. So at PayPal, we were already big fans of React, so that didn't really come into question. We were definitely going to use React. And then we have some teams that are really investing heavily in GraphQL. And my team was really excited about the prospect of using GraphQL, so we eagerly went down the rabbit hole and familiarized ourselves with the ecosystem and the community. During our research, in part, there's a great blog post by someone on the Apollo team named Peggy Razis who wrote a blog post called something like The Future of State Management. And that was really great. And I went to there was an Apollo GraphQL conference in San Francisco. I went to that, and I was like, this is all really great. And at the same time, we were kind of questioning whether or not we really needed Redux. Redux's downsides are well known. I've already talked with some people in the audience yesterday and today about them. So we were really seriously considering using Apollo Client with GraphQL. On top of that, last month, someone pointed me out to this tweet by Andrew Clark. Andrew Clark is one of the co-creators of Redux, and he had this to say about it, that Redux is a stupid event emitter with disproportionately excellent ecosystem of tools built on top of it. I wonder what the opportunity cost of that ecosystem is. Imagine if these tools were built on top of something other than a stupid event emitter like React. So I think that looking at it now, the last sentence, he's probably talking about hooks. But the reason this didn't affect our decision at all, because this tweet was made many, many months after we had already made our decision. But I point this out because a lot of people feel the same way about Redux. And even though I was never super anti-Redux, but I did want to move on to something more developed. So briefly, this talk really isn't too much about Apollo Client, but I just wanted to show a brief example of Apollo Client for anybody who hasn't used it. And you can see why something like this would be attractive. I mean, we've got our functional component, our query up top, and what I really like is we've got loading and error states kind of taken care of for us. I mean, we've already seen talks talk about like, oh, it's really, really encumbering to have to handle loading and error states because there's a lot of human work involved and therefore a lot of capacity for error. So anyway, my team was using GraphQL, Apollo Client, and we were happy for a while. However, we soon began to second-guess our choice. We found that there were some limitations and peculiarities about Apollo Client that we didn't like, and also we found ourselves missing many of the core features of Redux. In the process, we started to reevaluate Redux and take a look at what was good about it. What were we really missing? And I think in the process, identified what I think is really great about Redux. So again, I'm not going to talk too much about Apollo Client. I have a high opinion of the Apollo team, and I think that it's a great product. And neither is my point to just use Redux, which again, I'll discuss hooks at the end. I think, again, some of the critiques of Redux are justified. But nevertheless, I think that there's going to be something valuable underneath Redux which we should all take away. And again, I'm also going to talk about by what means we evaluate a new technology. So let's go back to this Andrew Clark tweet real quick. Even he acknowledges that the quality of tooling is exceedingly good, and we had become really lazy in our development. We had become very reliant on the Redux dev tools, time traveling, things of the like, even some of the middleware. And for all you product engineers out there, ask yourselves, do I really have the time to sacrifice, can I really sacrifice time to have my team learn some new technology and then not have the ecosystem and tooling around it? And again, this isn't the fault of any other technology. Redux has just been around really a long time, and it's been the standard in the ecosystem and the community has rewarded it accordingly. Further, we don't really know the future of GraphQL at PayPal. Again, PayPal devs are investing a fair amount of energy into it, and my team is a fan, and so far, we've encountered a good degree of success using it. However, again, its future is far from certain. So for all I know, for some reason, we might need to go back to REST APIs or REST endpoints, or we might have to have some REST APIs, and then we can use GraphQL when we want. And this is where a clear benefit of something like Redux shines, or any other technology for that matter, which is really agnostic to this fact. Redux really doesn't care where I'm getting my data from. And so today, you know, my app, or one of my apps is in GraphQL and Redux. Oh, and I also didn't want to use some combination, which I think would be for obvious reasons. So these two reasons, or these few reasons, are kind of trivial in my opinion. They're kind of superficial. But as I mentioned, you know, I'm a product engineer, and I'm sure many of you are as well. And sometimes these trivial reasons are good enough for us to use a technology. However, upon further reflection, again, something deeper is really, really strong about Redux, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. And I'm not going to bury the lead anymore. What I think is really, really powerful about Redux is the functional paradigm that exists underneath it. And before I talk about that, I want to talk a little bit about how I approach the problem. So this is Aristotle. He's an ancient Greek philosopher, and he had lots of things to say. But one thing that really stuck with me when I was reading him is the way he examined a problem or subject. Whenever he was approaching something new, he would always begin by examining the opinions of everyone else. And it's not just that was really great. It was the way he was never dismissive and would always attempt to find the truth, or what was really great about an opinion, even if the opinion on the surface appeared to be false or even insane. So I'm going to go through one case real quick. So Aristotle spent a lot of his time talking about change. What is the nature of change? What's the definition of change? How is change possible? And in doing so, he examined two pretty ridiculous opinions. One is that of Parmenides, who's on the left here. Parmenides held that everything we perceive is an illusion. Change does not occur. Our perception of change is merely an error of opinion. So this opinion is pretty ridiculous in my opinion, but trust me, the ancient Greeks actually had a really hard time refuting this, and this guy actually had whole cults devoted to him. His most famous founder was Zeno, of Zeno's paradoxes. The second ridiculous opinion is that of Heraclitus, who's on the right. He spoke in poems, so he said, "No one steps in the same river twice." And what he's getting at is that everything is constantly in flux and there's no identity. So the you are not the same you were 5 minutes ago, and you will not be the same thing 5 minutes from now. And I think it's fair to say that both these opinions are pretty ridiculous, and most people would just ignore them. After all, it's fairly obvious that change occurs. My hands are moving, I'm speaking. And then similarly, in some respects, if I step in the Mississippi River today and tomorrow, something about it's the same. The water is constantly moving, so it changes, but something about it's the same. However, these opinions were took very seriously by Aristotle, and he used them as the starting point to build his own system of physics and philosophy. And what I took from it is that his belief that no one would ever earnestly hold an opinion without there being some truth to it, that I could apply the same logic to not so ridiculous opinions. So what does this have to do with Redux? I use this extreme example of Aristotle dealing with ridiculous opinions, and Redux is not ridiculous. However, I talk to a lot of people, and some people think it's like a foregone conclusion. They're like, oh, you're still using Redux. It's really annoying. I have to go to like 4 different files to access my data. And OK, fair enough. But why has it been so popular the past 3 to 4 years? Why has it been like the standard for most web apps? And so that's kind of what I want to talk about. And again, I'm not going to talk about that you have to use Redux or that Redux is perfect. I think some of the critiques are justified. But however, even though there's some less than perfect aspects to it, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to figure out what's great about it. I just want to make sure we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater if you end up moving around, if you end up moving from Redux. And so before I talk about Redux, there's one last thing I want to address, which I think will also influence the way we look at it. If we think about the same reason, you could ask the same question about React. Why has React been so popular ever since it was made? And I think the reason is because the essential elements of React are very simple. I think that oftentimes when people discuss React, they think, oh, it's got a high barrier to entry, Webpack's a nightmare, just getting an app up and running is tough, state management is hard. Fair enough, but I'll tell you that at PayPal we have a lot of interns, and when they come in, they don't know React, but if they know JavaScript, I'll say, write me a function that returns me markup, and bam, they know React. And if I say, okay, you need some data, let's talk about class-based components, and they can basically read them. They're written really well, and it's very easy. So there's much more complex situations that involve more complexity from React, but the core elements of React, I think, are very simple. So similarly, in my opinion, the core elements of Redux are also very simple. I think maybe this is a little small. I'm not sure everyone could read it, but this is just a reducer. So if you boil down what Redux is, it's actually people complain about it being really complicated, but it's actually fairly simple. It's a dispatch of an action. It's the reducing of an immutable state object in an iterator over subscribers, and that's about it. And my opinion is that pattern is what made Redux so successful, and that pattern we should try and preserve. And the reason it's become so successful is because, well, that's what I'm going to go over now. So at PayPal, we employed Douglas Crockford, who wrote this book. He's kind of a well-known JavaScript guy. And if I had to summarize his opinion, I would say it like this. The bad parts of JavaScript are really bad, and you should avoid them like the plague. And the good parts are really, really good, and when you harness them correctly, it can make JavaScript one of the most powerful programming languages. And perhaps the most powerful pattern is the functional programming pattern, for which JavaScript is really well equipped. So let's briefly talk about functional programming. A lot of people have been talking about it today, which I've been really surprised and happy about. So functional programming is the process of building software by composing pure functions, avoiding mutable data, and avoiding side effects. Pure functions are functions which, given the same inputs, always return the same output. and have no side effects. An immutable object is an object that can't be modified after it's created. Immutability is a central concept of functional programming because without it, the data in your program becomes lossy, and state history can abandon, and bugs can creep into your code. So functional programming is a programming paradigm, meaning that it's a way of thinking about software construction based on some fundamental defining principles. Functional code tends to be concise, more predictable, and critically, from my point of view, it's very easy to test. You know you've written a really good function when the test feels dumb to write. The whole goal I'm trying to achieve, so why is this so good? It's because the whole goal that I'm trying to achieve when I write applications is not cleverness or elegance. Rather, it's to write a program that works well and is free of error. And the thesis that I hold is that following a functional programming paradigm as much as possible helps me achieve that goal. Namely, it helps me avoid as many errors as possible. So let's go back to Redux. In the core of Redux, this reducer, we will see that the pattern Redux implements is as relevant as powerful as ever. Redux is fundamentally built on the notion of an immutable state object and a pure side effect-free reducer function. There really isn't that much to it. Similarly, if I have a new intern and I say, they know what this is. Some people don't like the switch case statement, but you don't even need that. It's just a pure function that returns a new immutable object. So the middleware, the API, the tooling, those are all extras to Redux. Some of these we like, some of these we like to complain about. And it's these things that people typically discuss when they're talking about Redux. They talk about boilerplate. They talk about map dispatch to props. But in reality, we should also ultimately be discussing this, in my opinion, the power, the clarity, simplicity of the reducer pattern. So when you choose a state management system, you're buying into a pattern. And the thing about Redux's pattern, it's really, really good. And despite the many criticisms about how complex it is, the fact of the matter is the basics of it are not. And this is why we went back to it after experimenting with Apollo Client. So if we look back at Apollo Client real quickly, we'll see it's kind of, we look at it again and it feels a little strange because we've got something that looks like a functional component, but then we've got this query component which is coming from somewhere, and it's certainly impure. So it just feels strange. And even if you look at the Redux core code, you really can't find anything that isn't just plain old JavaScript, which is what I like. Because ultimately, when I write programs, I want to write them for the next programmer, so that the next programmer comes in and is able to understand them and read what's going on. So here's where I can talk a little bit about hooks. I didn't change my slide, but I have a line in here that says, I really hope that React itself incorporates this pattern out of the box, so that way we don't need to use Redux, which is kind of what hooks are about. And if people have questions about it, we could discuss it more in the Q&A, or you could just find me after. I think that that's probably the way to go forward. However, I was at ReactiveConf, and I think that a lot of people maybe didn't watch the talk to the end, which the point was it's in alpha, and you should not put it in production yet, and it's merely a proposal, and then they want feedback for it. So don't dive headfirst into it yet, but definitely I think that it's very promising, and I think that that's probably the direction things would go, because then we can remove a lot of things that people don't like about Redux while kind of keeping that core pattern. Alternatively, you don't really need a library at all. You could do your own thing and not even use the useReducer hook from React. But the downside of that is that you miss the tooling. You're not going to have, you'd have to build your own time traveler or your own dev tool function, which is that's possible. But if you already have something that's built for you, that's really powerful. So again, just in closing, part of the reason React has enjoyed such success in the front-end community is because, especially since the introduction of ES6 syntax, building in React feels a lot like you're just coding in JavaScript. And our intellectual effort is spent more on component architecture and other challenges rather than on something that seems completely foreign to the language. And my contention is that the same is true for this core feature of Redux. The essence of Redux reads like pure functional JavaScript, which makes sense because it is just pure functional JavaScript. So when I started diving deeper into Redux, I not only came to reappreciate the library, but I also came away with a stronger sense of by what means I would judge a new technology and how I would decide whether or not I wanted to use it with my team. I want to use libraries that not only clearly show me what's going on, but also ones that use the so-called good parts of JavaScript, namely solid functional programming principles. So in the future, these are the ones that are going to be heavily preferred by me and my team. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. We have some nice questions for you as well. Why the Redux and not the React context?
Yeah, I think that, so I forgot to mention, if anyone who has not watched Ryan Florence's talk from ReactiveConf a few days ago, you should definitely go watch it. And in it, he doesn't really go through the entire thing, but he uses the use reducer hook, and then he talks about how, all you need to do is hook it up to the React context, but he doesn't do it, so you'll have to figure it out yourself. But I'm sure there's someone who's already figured it out. But in short, if you can use the use reducer hook with the React context, I think that that's probably going to replace Redux. I think today, some of the more trivial reasons that I identified, namely, the dev tools, the time traveler, and things like that, those are reasons why I really wanted to keep using the library. But I mean, Redux itself uses the React context API, and it used it before when it was just experimental. So the two are very, very similar. So in short, you could use the React context as well and still implement this pattern.
They like it.
All right.
Do you believe that the biggest uncertainty in choosing Apollo client is it being tightly coupled with GraphQL, which creates an unwanted dependency?
Yes, I do, actually. And that was, again, I really love the Apollo team, and I think they're great. Everything they do is great. And when I went to the GraphQL conference, it really makes the most sense if you completely restructure your entire workflow around Apollo. And that wasn't something my team was willing to do. And moreover, there still are arguments. I mean, PayPal has been around for a long time, and I'm sure some of your companies have been around for a long time. And who knows whether or not you'll be able to fully incorporate GraphQL, or whether or not you'll have to have some RESTful APIs. And having a mix of state management systems seems like an obvious no-no to me. It seems like I just don't want to add extra dependencies where I don't need them. So the answer to that question is yes, in short.
Can you use Apollo client and Redux together?
So yes, but I wouldn't recommend it. There's one team I know of that does this. In fact, he initially wanted to use entirely Apollo client, and then just found some trouble with it, and he ended up creating like a global state variable. So then he was like, oh, that's ugly, so I'm going to use Redux for that. And then he had this awkward mixture. And I think that that's obviously a bad idea. You want to pick one and stick to it, and then think about some of the things I talked about to make the right choice for you and your team.
What's your opinion about Redux with Angular?
So I've never used Redux with Angular. I haven't used Angular in over 2 years, so I don't have an opinion on it. I'm sure you can use it. Oh, OK, people like that. I'm sure you can use it. I mean, one of the benefits of Redux is it intentionally does not care. And I think that that's really powerful.
Have you considered Apollo link state? Yes,
I didn't discuss it in my presentation, but I also had Apollo link state in my app. And great technology, but I was really missing some of the things that I mentioned in the talk.
And maybe we can take one more?
Sure.
Do you have some solution to avoid writing so much code for reducers?
Yes. My solution is don't overuse Redux. Don't overuse your reducers. I don't use Redux for any of my UI state. I use local state for my UI state. And I think that I've seen there's some libraries out there, and I've seen some apps where everything is put in Redux. Everything is put in Redux, and then they have massive reducers, and components start re-rendering that aren't intended to re-render. And moreover, you've got events flying all over the place. I think that that's not a good idea. I think this is in part due to some of the tutorials which really emphasize the API over how to think about a Redux app. So in short, my thought is don't overuse it. Use it maybe only for data fetches or something like that, things over the wire, but not for UI state.
Thank you, Max.
Thank you.